Well, Merry Christmas, Adam. Merry Christmas, Adam. Merry Christmas. It's so good to see all of you here, especially as we are closing up our series, Do You See What I See, this week. And over the last 4 weeks, we've been looking at different characters in the Christmas story. We started out looking at Bethlehem, not really a character, but playing such an important part in the Christmas story. And then we saw Bethlehem, and then we talked about Mary and Joseph, and the part that Mary especially played in the Christmas story. And then we looked at the shepherds in the fields and the part that they played, and the magi that came from the east. And even here with our nativity scene, as I said before, we've had 5 different visitors, one for each week over the last 5 weeks. Here is a quick glimpse at the 5 visitors that we had. Okay, that's enough. Because if you weren't keeping track, you don't get to see. And last week, one of the things that we talked about was with the Magi was the fact that those 3 visitors who are there on my left side were not actually at the nativity scene. They were not part of that cast on that night that Jesus was born, that they actually appeared later. And we talked about how there weren't really three wise men, 3 kings, 3 magi. That wasn't really what it was. And so as we close out our series today, what I want to do is I want to look at someone that we don't often think about when we think of the Christmas story. In fact, you never see this person's face on a Christmas card. You never hear songs that are sung just about this person. But this person plays a pivotal role in the Christmas story, and that was Herod. King Herod, or Herod the Great. And we started to actually look at this last week. In fact, we saw last week the critical role that Herod plays in this Christmas story. And if there is a villain in the Christmas story, Herod is the guy. And so you might be wondering why, right? As we're coming to the climax of the Christmas story, here we are 2 days before Christmas. Why is it that we would be talking about Herod of all people? Well, I'm going to tell you from the beginning so that you will know. If you're following along in your notes, this is the first one. This is the big idea for today, and it's really simple, and here it is. Looking at King Herod helps us see King Jesus. That's the theme, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Because last week, we actually talked a little bit about Herod. When we talked about the Magi, and if you missed last week's message, because we really unpacked that whole thing, or actually any of the previous messages, you can catch up with them online. But for today, what I want us to do in the time that we have left together is to look at the Christmas story as recorded by Matthew. And this is how Matthew writes his Christmas story. And it's a little bit different than what Wyatt so wonderfully read for us. She read out of Luke's account. This is from another man who wrote an account of Jesus' birth, a man named Matthew, and this is what Matthew writes. He says, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. Now, some of your translations, if you read this in different translations, you might have it read there as Herod the king. But essentially, it's Herod is the king, and that's what Matthew is telling us. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." And so we talked about last week how this passage actually relates to the wise men, and it wasn't just one guy or 3 guys on camels, but it was actually a whole caravan of people who came in. And they came in from the east, which, if you'll look at this map, it meant that they likely came from an area that was known at the time as Parthia, what is today modern-day Iran or Iraq. That's Parthia. And that's where they would have come from to come into Judea and the south part of Judea where Bethlehem is. And then it says, Matthew writes this, he says, King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. And another thing we talked about last week, I'm really plugging last week's message. Another thing we talked about last week was the reason that King Herod was deeply disturbed, which had a lot to do with his history with the Parthians, But it's also because of the question that the wise men asked, because they said, where is the newborn king of the Jews? And this is one of those questions that sometimes in our lives, someone asks us a question that really hits home with us, like it cuts into us deep. This was one of those questions for King Herod, because see, what the wise men were saying was, we don't want to see the appointed king of the Jews. We want to see the one who was born as king of the Jews. And Matthew tells us that it's not just Herod that's freaking out, that the wise men are there, that it's also all of Jerusalem is freaking out. And so Herod, who is a Jew but is not a Jew, does know the Hebrew scriptures. And because the wise men asked for the newborn king of the Jews, did you get that? The wise men said, where is the newborn king of the Jews? Herod knows exactly who they're talking about. Listen to what he says next. He says, this is Herod, called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? See, he didn't say, where is the newborn king of the Jews supposed to be born? He said, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? Because Herod, who is a Jew but is not a Jew, is familiar with the Hebrew scriptures. And so he's familiar with the prophecies of the coming Messiah, the one who was supposed to come and be the true king of Israel. Which brings all of this like right in Herod's face, right? Because when they ask Herod that question, when the wise men ask him that question, they're basically saying to him, you are not the true king of the Jews. In his book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, Kenneth Bailey talks about this. He talks about the complexity of Herod. Because religiously, Herod is Jewish. He rules the Jews. He sits on a Jewish throne. He does Jewish things to keep the peace. Even though he's hated by the Jewish people, religiously he's Jewish. But culturally, Herod is Greek. His first language was Greek. The culture he was raised in was Greek. In fact, he was just a boy when Rome came into Israel to rule Israel. And so you had his Greek culture and the Roman culture that came in superimposed on top of it, which was very common in that time. That's why it was referred to as the Greco-Roman culture. Politically, he was Roman. He was there as king because he was appointed by the Romans. But racially, he was Arab. His mother was from Nabatea, which is in the south. His father was from Idumea, which was an area south of Judea that was settled by the descendants of a man named Esau, who was Jacob's brother, in an area called Edom. But ancestrally, he's an Edomite, which means he's from the tribe of Esau. Now, we have this map here, and you can see it that in New Testament times, the area south of Judea was called Idumea. And Idumea is where Herod's family was from. His father was from there. But in what they call the intertestamental period, which is the time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, the people who were in Edom, which is just north of where it says Nabatea, they migrated across to Idumea. They settled over in Idumea. And that area where Idumea is was populated by Arabs. The capital city was a city called Petra. And Petra was where Herod's mother was born. And so on both his father's side and his mother's side, Herod has an Arab racial background, but he is living as the king of the Jews. Now, there's a Jewish historian named Josephus, and Josephus tells us that the last king of the Hasmonean dynasty before Herod would talk about Herod and referred to him as an Idumean. He would say, hey, you're an Idumean, which to us doesn't mean anything, but in that time and in that culture, that was an insult to Herod. It was an insult to him because telling Herod that he was an Idumean was telling him that he was half Jewish. But he's 0% Jewish. And so that was an insult to him. Because around 200 BC, all of the Idumeans, everybody who had migrated over from Edom to Idumea, was forced to convert to Judaism. So he was one of those people that converted to Judaism. He was not racially or religiously Jewish when he was born. But see, that's not all. There's this prophecy from Genesis, which is the first book of the Hebrew Scriptures, and it says this. It says, and the Lord told her, and her was a woman named Rebekah, who was Isaac's wife, who would give birth to Esau and Jacob. He says, the Lord told her, the sons in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. And so Esau, who was in Edom, was the older son, and Jacob, who remained in the Judean area, was the younger son, and the prophecy said that Esau was going to serve Jacob. And that was what we saw. There were other prophecies. There was a prophecy that the Messiah was going to pass through the line of Jacob. There was a prophecy that there would be a complete destruction of the line of Esau. In fact, in that time, there were Pharisees who lived at that time, religious leaders of the Jewish people, who refused to pledge their allegiance to Rome or to Caesar or to Herod. And they would prophesy that Israel was going to be taken from Herod and given to a new king who would bring about restoration and wholeness. This drove Herod crazy, but he couldn't do anything about it because they were religious leaders and he was a Jew. And so when we look at all of these things that are going on in Herod's background, all of these things that are going on around him, and we already know that he was paranoid that his kingdom was going to be taken away, it's easy to understand why he's trying to trick the wise men into telling him where Jesus was. Because Jesus was a threat to Herod's power and Herod's kingdom. And Herod had to eliminate any threat, anything that threatened his power and his kingdom. We talked last week about how Herod had 3 of his sons killed. He had his wife killed. And so when he heard that there was a newborn king of the Jews, he sent his soldiers into Bethlehem to kill all the 2-year-old boys and younger because he had to eliminate the threat. He had to eliminate the one who all the people expected to be the king of the Jews. And this shows us something that a lot of us know because we've experienced this in our lives. We've seen it in other people's lives, that those who desire to rule on their own always end up destroying whatever it is that they're trying to rule over. Which brings us back to Matthew's account of the Christmas story and something that Matthew tries to tell us. And he does it in such a subtle way, but such a significant way. I'm going to go back to the beginning, Matthew 2, verse 1, and this is what it says. Again, we just read this. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. So Matthew is introducing us to Herod as king. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." And Matthew says, King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. So here we are again, and Matthew refers to him as King Herod. Now this is the part that I want you to see. See, because right after this, Herod meets the Magi. He meets the wise men. He talks to them. And he says, listen, you guys go find the Messiah, and when you find him, come back and tell me where he is, because Herod says, I want to go and worship him also, right? Sure you do. But that's what he told the wise men. He said, go. And so they leave, and they meet Jesus, the true king. They meet him exactly where the prophecy said they would find him. And the very next time that King Herod is mentioned is about 5 or 6 verses later in verse 12. And listen to what Matthew writes. He says, when it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. Did you catch it? Herod is no longer referred to as king. He's just Herod. Up to this time, he's King Herod. Whenever Matthew writes about him, he's King Herod. But now something has changed. And what has changed is they've met Jesus. They've met Jesus. They've met the real king. They've met the Messiah. And now the guy that used to be King Herod is just Herod. In fact, if you read through the rest of that chapter, they mention him 5 more times. And every single time, he's just Herod. And I think it's really cool when you read this, that Matthew is trying to tell us something. And he's so subtle when he tells it to us, but it's so powerful, the shift that happens after the people meet Jesus. Essentially, Matthew is telling us this: once you meet Jesus, you will know who the true king is. And that was just as true now as it was back then. That when you know who the true king is, it doesn't matter who has the title of king. That when you know who the true king is, your allegiance, your loyalty, your obedience all belong to the true king. True then, true now. And as we've gone through this whole series, as we've gone through this Christmas season, and we celebrate the fact that Jesus came into the world in the most vulnerable form of humanity, as a helpless infant, born to a poor teenage girl, to be witnessed by common shepherds, and then to be worshiped by the richest and most powerful and most influential men. For them and for everyone in Bethlehem, Jesus came into the world for all of us. And it matters to us today because Jesus came into the world for you. Just as you are. Just as you are today. Just as you are right now. We're spending all of this time celebrating, and he has come. Yes, and we celebrate that he has come, but he has come for you and for me just as we are right now. And here we are on the Saturday before Christmas, which is the worst possible day before Christmas because it's the day everyone is doing their last-minute shopping. Some of you know exactly where you're going right after this. Good thing the stores are open till 11 p.m. But we're at the height of the Christmas season. We've done our Christmas shopping. We've done our Christmas decorating. We've done some of our Christmas gift wrapping. Right? We've been to the Christmas parties. We've watched the Christmas movies. We've listened to the Christmas music. And in 2 days, we're going to celebrate Christmas. But in all of that, let's not forget that we're celebrating Jesus. It's come to be such a horrible cliche to remember the reason for the season. I wish it didn't rhyme, because if it didn't rhyme, it would seem more serious. But that is the reason that we're celebrating. We're not celebrating simply the fact that Jesus was born, but we're celebrating that Jesus came into the world. That he came into the world offering his love, his grace, his forgiveness. And the part that always gets me, I don't know about you, but the part that I always have had trouble with is that he offers it to you and me freely. That it's a gift. See, how I grew up, you don't get stuff for free. You have to earn it. You have to deserve it. And if you do something wrong, you've got to win your way back. And so for many, many years of my life, it was hard for me to conceive that doing everything I'm doing right now in my life, everything that I have done in the past in my life, that Jesus would love me and welcome me exactly as I am right now. And yet when I met Jesus, and I was almost 30 years old when I met Jesus for the first time. When I met him, everything changed. Because when you meet the true king, everything changes. He's offered us the greatest Christmas gift that we could ever imagine. Something that no matter how hard we tried, no matter how much money we have, no matter how much power we have, no matter how smart we are or how good looking we are, that we could never get on our own. And he offers it to us as his Christmas gift. And so the question I want to leave you with today is simply this. Have you met Jesus? Have you met Jesus? And if you have, then have you given him the position of being your king in your life? Because it's easy to let Christmas just be a time of celebration. And even as Christians, it's easy to let Christmas just be an intellectual exercise in, yes, we understand that we're celebrating the coming of Jesus. You know, a fancy 4-week birthday party. Or if you're Filipino, a 4-month birthday party. But as we get to the end of 2024, and we start making our New Year's resolutions and start to plan out for what this next year is going to look like, I just want you to think about that. Is Jesus just your Savior? Is he just the one that rescues you when you're in a jam? Is he just the one that saves you? Is he simply the one who gave his life for you? Or have you allowed Jesus to be your king? To be your king for eternity, but also to be your king right here, right now? Have you made the decision to align your life with his kingdom, and then to partner with him to expand his kingdom, as he said, to expand it on earth as it is in heaven? That's the question that we all have to ask ourselves as we come out and come through this Christmas season. A couple weeks ago, was it a couple weeks ago or last week, we had a baby dedication. Remind me, was it 2 weeks ago or was it last week? It was 2 weeks ago. And while I can't remember the date, I do remember the event and that beautiful little girl who could not stop staring at this ugly mug. December 9, that's right, December 9, I should have remembered that, December 9. And as I was holding her and watching her stare at me, because I can't remember anymore holding my kids and watching them stare at me, I thought, you know, this is just what parents do when they first hold their children. And I wonder what it was like for Mary that night, that Christmas night, when she held her son in her hands, knowing that he was going to be the one to save the entire world. And what would she have thought if she knew that just 33 years later, she would be watching her son give his life? We're going to celebrate Jesus' birth, but we're going to close our time together celebrating his sacrifice.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.